Welcome to Boring History for Bedtime. Tonight, as you snuggle into your cozy bed, perhaps with a warm drink beside you and the faint whispers of a chilly night outside, let's take a moment to appreciate the comforts we often take for granted. The hum of your heating system, the promise of hot water in the morning, a fridge full of food. These are modern luxuries that make winter a time of comfort. Now, close your eyes and let's journey back centuries. Imagine stepping into medieval Europe, where winter wasn't just a season, it was a dominant force, a relentless trial that shaped every aspect of life. The nights stretched longer and darker than they do today. The gentle flicker of a fire in the hearth might have been the only source of light, casting dancing shadows on the walls and breaking the profound silence with soft crackles. You'd hear the wind whispering through gaps in the windows, but it wouldn't be a gentle breeze. It would be a bone-chilling gust that seeped into everything. This was a time when Europe faced a climatic shift historians call the Little Ice Age. While not a full-blown ice age, it brought significantly colder temperatures for centuries. This meant winters were harsher, with more frequent and heavier snowfalls, and the cold lingered for longer periods. Rivers and lakes would freeze solid for months, and crops often succumbed to the severe chill. Can you imagine your entire existence depending on how much you could store for the coming cold and still not knowing if it would be enough? This wasn't the romantic, picturesque winter you see in movies today. This was a raw, unforgiving reality where every day was a struggle for survival. For the peasants and serfs, living in small, one-room hovels, it was a constant battle against the cold and hunger. They had neither adequate heating nor enough food to fill their bellies. But it wasn't just the poor who suffered. Even the wealthy, residing in their vast stone castles, weren't truly immune to the cold. Their massive fireplaces often sent more heat up the chimney than into the rooms, and they still had to hoard immense amounts of firewood and provisions to simply stay warm. For them, too, winter often felt like a prolonged confinement. In this journey, we'll delve deep into the brutal winters of the Middle Ages. We'll explore how people face these harsh conditions. We'll uncover their resilience, the ingenious methods they devised, and the small joys they managed to find amidst the darkness. We'll see how they leaned on community, faith, and family to survive the season. This story won't just be about history. It will highlight the extraordinary courage and tenacity of humans who found a way to live through seemingly impossible odds. So let's listen quietly and feel the distant echoes of that ancient winter. All right, let's continue our journey into the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, shifting our focus now to the vast majority of the population, the peasants and serfs who toiled on the land. Their lives, especially during the colder months, were a stark contrast to any modern comfort we can imagine. Picture their homes, not grand stone structures, but small, often single-room hovels. These were typically built from wattle and daub, a mix of woven branches and mud, with thatched roofs that, while offering some insulation, were prone to leaks and offered little protection against truly biting winds. And windows? Forget it. If there were openings, they were tiny, unglazed slits, covered with animal hides or wooden shutters to keep out the worst of the elements. This meant these homes were incredibly dark, even in the daytime, relying on the weak glow of a fire or a simple candle. Warmth, as you can imagine, was a constant struggle. The primary source of heat often came from the very animals they relied on for survival. Livestock like cows, pigs, or chickens might be brought inside the hovel, their body heat contributing to a tiny measurable increase in temperature. It sounds unsanitary by today's standards, and it certainly was, but in the face of freezing to death, practicality won out. A small hearth fire would be lit in the center of the room, but this was a precious commodity. Firewood was hard-earned, gathered from nearby forests, and had to be rationed carefully. Smoke often filled the air, as chimneys were either rudimentary or non-existent, leading to chronic respiratory problems. The heat from these fires barely warmed the extremities of the room, leaving corners frigid and damp. Then there was the ever-present threat of hunger. With winter, fresh food became a distant memory. Peasants lived off their stored provisions, grains, dried vegetables, perhaps some salted meat or fish if they were lucky. But these supplies were finite and often barely enough to last until the next harvest. Malnutrition and starvation were very real dangers. Imagine feeling the gnawing ache of hunger day after day, knowing that the fields outside were barren, locked under a blanket of snow and ice. Every calorie was precious, every meal a calculation of survival. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable to the devastating effects of hunger and the cold. Even in the depths of winter, life for the peasant wasn't static. It was a grueling daily grind. The chores changed, but the labor remained relentless. Animals still needed tending, often in freezing barns or even inside the hovel itself. Firewood had to be constantly gathered, chopped, and brought in, a backbreaking task in deep snow. Paths had to be cleared, and rudimentary repairs made to tools or homes. This wasn't work that stopped when the snow fell. It simply became harder, colder, and more exhausting. The cumulative effect of constant exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and endless physical exertion took a severe toll on the human body. Frostbite was common, leading to lost fingers and toes. Fatigue was chronic, and the constant drain on their energy left them vulnerable to illnesses. Their lives were a testament to endurance, a stark reminder of humanity's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. So far, we've talked about the grinding reality of winter for the peasants, but let's not imagine that wealth offered a golden ticket to warmth and comfort in the Middle Ages. Even the lords and ladies, residing in their imposing castles, faced significant challenges when the cold winds began to howl. These weren't the cozy, well-insulated homes we know today. Medieval castles, while impressive and formidable, were primarily designed for defense, not comfort. Their massive, thick stone walls, while excellent for keeping out invaders, were also incredibly good at absorbing and radiating cold. Imagine living inside a giant refrigerator. These grand structures often boasted large windows, but don't picture the clear glass panes we have. Glass was a luxury, if available at all, and most windows were simply open arches or covered with thin, oiled animal skins, or perhaps wooden shutters. These offered little protection against drafts and allowed icy air to seep into the vast, sprawling rooms. Heating these cavernous spaces was an enormous undertaking. Fireplaces were common, often grand and ornate, but their sheer size and inefficient design meant that most of the heat simply escaped up the wide chimneys, doing little to warm the entire room. To maintain even a semblance of warmth, an incredible amount of firewood was needed, far more than any single family could gather on their own. This demand for warmth meant a significant reliance on their staff. While the lord and lady might escape the direct labor, their comfort depended on a small army of servants. You'd have dedicated firekeepers whose sole job was to constantly feed the hearths. Others were responsible for the grueling task of hauling endless logs from the castle's wood stores, often through snow and ice. Kitchen staff had the monumental task of preparing meals for the entire household, a far more complex endeavor when fresh ingredients were scarce and preserving methods were rudimentary. The sheer logistics of keeping a medieval castle even mildly habitable in winter were immense, requiring constant effort from a large retinue of people. Food, while more plentiful than for the peasants, still presented its own set of challenges for the aristocracy. Fresh produce was largely unavailable. Their diet during winter relied heavily on salted meats, think preserved beef, pork, or fish, along with dried fruits, stored grains, and root vegetables from the harvest. Spices and herbs, if they could afford them, were crucial for making these preserved foods palatable and adding some variety. But the lack of fresh ingredients meant a monotonous diet, and despite their wealth, they too faced nutritional deficiencies over the long winter months. Social life within the castle walls often became very insular. Travel was dangerous and difficult, so the winter months often meant confinement indoors. Activities would revolve around indoor pursuits, reading, embroidery, playing board games, listening to minstrels, or perhaps planning for the coming spring. It was a time of enforced domesticity, a stark reminder that even at the top of the social ladder, winter was a demanding and often isolating period. In the face of such brutal winters, you might wonder how anyone made it through. The answer lies not just in sheer grit, but in the powerful bonds of community and family. For the common folk, survival wasn't a solo act, it was a collective effort. When resources dwindled, it was often the village or the immediate neighbors who stepped up. Imagine a family running low on firewood. A neighbor who had a slightly better harvest might share some of their meager supply, knowing that next year they might be the ones in need. Food and firewood were often bartered or even freely shared within a close-knit community, creating a vital safety net where everyone helped ensure that no one was left to freeze or starve alone. The concept of a close-knit extended family unit was absolutely critical. Several generations often lived under one roof or in very close proximity. This wasn't just about tradition. It was a practical necessity, especially during winter. More hands meant more help gathering wood, tending to the animals, or preparing the limited food. The collective body heat of many people huddled together could make a noticeable difference in a small, drafty home. Older family members held invaluable knowledge about traditional remedies, weather patterns, and survival skills, while younger, stronger members provided the physical labor. This shared living arrangement fostered a deep sense of interdependence, where each person contributed to the collective well-being, reinforcing the idea that they were truly all in it together. Winter also brought a shift in the nature of work, especially for those in rural areas. While outdoor farming halted, it didn't mean idleness. These colder months were a crucial period for indoor crafts and preparations for the coming spring. Peasants would spend hours repairing tools, weaving baskets, spinning wool into yarn, or mending clothing. This was also a time for planning the next agricultural cycle, mending fences, and tending to tasks that didn't require working the frozen soil. For some, like specialized artisans, winter was actually a prime time for their craft, producing goods that might be traded or sold when the weather improved. Perhaps one of the most fundamental strategies for staying alive was their clothing. Forget fashion. Warmth was the only criterion. People wore layers upon layers of clothing, primarily made from wool and animal hides. Wool, even when damp, retains some insulating properties, making it invaluable. Animal furs and leather provided excellent protection against wind and snow. Footwear was often made from thick leather, sometimes stuffed with straw. Even amidst the grinding hardship of medieval winters, there were vital moments of respite and celebration. Imagine the relentless cold, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat of illness. It would have been unbearable without glimmers of hope, without opportunities for the community to come together and collectively push back against the darkness. This is where winter festivals became incredibly important. They weren't just about religious observance, they were crucial for mental and social survival, offering a brief, much-needed injection of joy and entertainment. The most prominent of these was undoubtedly the Christmas season. Unlike our modern commercialized Christmas, the medieval celebration wasn't about endless gifts. Instead, it was a period, often lasting 12 days, that marked the longest holiday from work in the entire year. For peasants, this meant a precious break from back-breaking labor in the fields. It was a time for limited feasting, for sharing whatever scarce food and drink they had managed to preserve, and for simply being together. The spirit of this season was less about extravagance and more about communal warmth and spiritual reflection, a quiet celebration of light in the darkest part of the year. A particularly interesting tradition was the Feast of St. Stephen's Day, celebrated on December 26th. This day often involved almsgiving to the poor and a unique ritual that temporarily turned the social order on its head. In some communities, a commoner, often a servant or a junior cleric, would be chosen as the Lord of Misrule. For a brief period, this individual would preside over the festivities, playfully mocking authority and societal norms. It was a carnival-like atmosphere where the usual rules were relaxed, allowing for laughter, revelry, and a release of tension that built up over months of strict social hierarchy and hard work. It was a safety valve, a moment of delightful chaos that helped people forget their daily struggles, if only for a few precious hours. Beyond Christmas, other winter festivals and observances played a role. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, was often marked by ancient pagan traditions that had been incorporated into Christian customs. It was a symbolic moment, celebrating the gradual return of longer daylight hours and the promise of spring. These celebrations were often communal, involving gatherings around large fires, symbolic rituals to ward off evil spirits, and collective prayers for warmth and fertility. For common folk and nobles alike, these long winter nights were also filled with simpler, yet vital, forms of entertainment. Storytelling was paramount, with tales of heroes, saints, and local folklore passed down through generations. Music, often played on simple instruments, provided a backdrop to gatherings, and various games, from dice to rudimentary board games, helped pass the time. These shared activities were essential for maintaining morale and fostering a sense of togetherness, reminding people that even when the outside world was frozen and harsh, there was still warmth and humanity to be found within their communities. As the long, grim medieval winter slowly began to loosen its icy grip, a new kind of anticipation would build. After months of huddling indoors, battling the cold, and surviving on dwindling provisions, the first faint whispers of spring were like a beacon of hope. This shift wasn't just marked by the warming air or the melting snow. It was celebrated with a significant tradition known as Plough Monday. This day, typically the first Monday after Epiphany, around January 7th, wasn't just another date on the calendar. It was a vital ritual, marking the symbolic start of the agricultural year and, more profoundly, the reawakening of life itself. Plough Monday was essentially the peasants' way of celebrating the end of winter's cruel reign and preparing for the arduous work that lay ahead. Imagine the relief. For months, the land had been frozen solid, unyielding and barren. Now, it was time to wake it up. Farmers would bring out their plows, often decorated with ribbons and greenery, and sometimes even take them to the church for a blessing. This wasn't just about readying tools. It was a communal acknowledgement that the cycle of life was turning once more. Preparations for cultivating the land again would begin, from mending equipment to assessing seed stores, all fueled by the renewed energy that spring's approach brought. The importance of Plough Monday can't be overstated when you consider the constant threat of famine and food shortages that plagued medieval life. The success of the upcoming harvest wasn't just about prosperity. It was about survival. So this day carried with it the immense hope for new crops, for bountiful yields that would replenish their dwindling larders and ensure they wouldn't face the same severe hunger again. It was a collective sigh of relief and a prayer for a prosperous year, a deep inherent trust in the earth's ability to provide, even after such harsh conditions. Beyond the practicalities, Plough Monday had a profound psychological effect on society. Imagine the mental toll of months of darkness, cold, and uncertainty. This was a day that actively acknowledged and celebrated emerging from winter's harsh grip. It brought a renewed sense of purpose and optimism. People could finally look forward to working outdoors again, to longer days, and to the promise of fresh food. It was a day that reinforced their connection to the land and to each other, a communal reassurance that they had endured, and that life, despite its challenges, would continue to flourish. It was in essence a quiet but powerful testament to human resilience and the enduring hope for a brighter, warmer tomorrow. As if the cold and hunger weren't enough, medieval winters brought with them another, often more insidious threat: widespread disease and devastating epidemics. When people were forced into close quarters to escape the biting cold, their homes became unwitting breeding grounds for illness. Imagine a small one-room hovel, shared not just by a family, but perhaps also by their animals, all huddled together for warmth. These cramped and unsanitary living conditions were perfect for the rapid spread of infections. Poor ventilation meant that airborne diseases lingered, and a lack of basic hygiene made it easy for pathogens to pass from person to person. The illnesses that swept through medieval communities during winter were often brutal. Common colds and coughs could quickly escalate into something far more severe. Influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, consumption, were particularly rampant. What might be a minor inconvenience for us today could quickly become a death sentence back then. Pneumonia, with its severe lung inflammation, was a common killer, especially among the young and old. Tuberculosis, a chronic and debilitating disease, would slowly waste away its victims, and its spread was often exacerbated by the damp, confined spaces people inhabited during the colder months. These weren't just isolated cases, they were outbreaks that could decimate entire villages and towns. Compounding the problem was the severe lack of effective medical facilities and knowledge. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, and certainly no vaccines. If you fell ill, your best hope lay with local healers, midwives, or the limited knowledge of village elders. They relied heavily on herbal remedies and traditional folk cures, some of which might have offered minor relief, but few provided genuine cures for serious infections. Doctors, if available at all, were scarce and often adhered to medical theories that were largely ineffective or even harmful, such as bloodletting. The widespread absence of proper diagnosis and effective treatment meant that once a disease took hold, it was incredibly difficult to stop. Furthermore, the very conditions of winter weakened the body's natural defenses. The persistent shortage of food led to widespread malnutrition, which in turn severely compromised people's immune systems. A body constantly battling cold and hunger had little energy left to fight off infections. This weakened immunity meant that even relatively common illnesses could quickly become life-threatening. The result was a chillingly high mortality rate, particularly amongst the most vulnerable members of society, infants and young children, whose tiny bodies struggled against the elements and disease, and the elderly, whose strength was already waning. For them, winter was not just a season, it was often the final chapter. The constant presence of sickness and death cast a long, dark shadow over the entire medieval population during these harsh months. Beyond the biting cold and rampant diseases, medieval winters brought with them perhaps the most terrifying specter of all: famine. For communities whose very survival depended directly on the land, the failure of a harvest was not just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. Imagine investing an entire year's labor into your crops, only for them to be utterly destroyed by an unexpected, brutal cold snap, or a relentless, out-of-season deluge of rain or snow that choked the fields. These crop failures, triggered by unpredictable and extreme weather patterns during the Little Ice Age, meant that the very foundation of their food supply was shattered. Even in good years, storing food was a monumental challenge for medieval people. There was no refrigeration, no canning, no modern preservation techniques. Grains had to be kept dry and safe from dampness, which could lead to mold. Meats were heavily salted or smoked, but even then, they had a limited shelf life. Root vegetables could be stored in cool cellars, but they too would eventually spoil. And then, there were the pests. Rats, mice, and insects were constant threats, capable of consuming or contaminating vast quantities of precious stored food. Imagine working all year, only to see your meager winter provisions slowly disappear, devoured by creatures or ruined by the elements, leaving you with nothing. When famine struck, its effects rippled through society with devastating speed. As food supplies dwindled, prices for what little remained would skyrocket, making it impossible for the poor to afford even basic sustenance. This led to widespread desperation. The social fabric would begin to unravel. Reports from the time described desperate acts of theft, with people stealing from their neighbors just to survive. Sometimes, this desperation escalated into riots and civil unrest, as starving populations lashed out against authorities or wealthier individuals hoarding food. The chaos and breakdown of order added another layer of terror to an already dire situation. The long-term effects of prolonged hunger on the human body were horrific. Chronic weakness was pervasive, making people susceptible to every passing illness. Their bodies, starved of essential nutrients, simply couldn't fight back. Diseases that might otherwise be minor became fatal, and the very act of living became an unbearable struggle. For many, starvation was a slow, agonizing death, often compounded by sickness. In the grim reality of a medieval famine, people were often forced into desperate measures to find food. They might resort to foraging in the forests for wild berries, roots, or whatever edible plants they could identify, even if they were barely nutritious. Hunting became a vital, yet incredibly difficult pursuit, requiring immense energy and skill in the harsh winter landscape. Every scrap of food was a lifeline, and the shadow of hunger was a constant, chilling companion throughout the brutal medieval winter. As if the cold, hunger, and disease weren't enough, medieval winters brought yet another terrifying and constant threat. Fire. Imagine living in towns and cities where almost everything was made of wood. Buildings were often constructed shoulder to shoulder, with timber frames, thatched roofs, and wooden interiors. This meant that once a fire started, it could spread with frightening speed and intensity. A single spark, a falling ember, or an unattended candle could quickly engulf an entire street, or even a whole district. In these densely packed communities, fire wasn't just a danger to a single home. It was a potential catastrophe for the entire settlement. The very methods people used to stay warm were, ironically, the biggest fire hazards. Most homes, from humble hovels to grand castles, relied on open fires in hearths for heat and cooking. Chimneys, if they existed at all, were often poorly constructed, lacking proper lining or maintenance, making chimney fires a constant risk. Sparks could easily fly out onto flammable materials like straw bedding or dried rushes that covered floors. Candles and oil lamps, used for light in the long, dark winter nights, were another precarious source of ignition. This constant reliance on exposed flames meant that every family lived with the silent, ever-present dread of an accidental fire. And if a fire did break out, the means to fight it were incredibly limited. There were no fire departments, no hydrants, and no pressurized hoses. The primary method of firefighting involved forming bucket brigades, where people would frantically pass buckets of water from a well or river to the burning structure. But in winter, this became even more challenging. Rivers and wells could freeze over, making water scarce, and even if water was available, the intense cold meant that anything splashed would quickly turn to ice, creating treacherous conditions. The sheer speed with which medieval fires consumed wooden structures often meant that by the time anyone could gather enough water, the damage was already catastrophic. The consequences of a winter fire were devastating, potentially even more so than in warmer months. Not only would homes be utterly destroyed, leaving families immediately homeless in freezing temperatures, but precious food stores would also be lost. For a community already struggling with scarcity, the destruction of grain, salted meat, and dried provisions could lead directly to starvation. Imagine losing everything you own, your only shelter, and your winter's sustenance in one swift blaze, with nowhere to go and nothing to eat, amidst a landscape already gripped by ice and snow. The aftermath of a fire in medieval winter was a desperate struggle for survival, forcing people to seek what little shelter and aid they could find from their neighbors, or face the grim reality of the unforgiving cold. As if the constant threats of cold, hunger, disease, and fire weren't enough, simply moving from one place to another in medieval winter presented its own terrifying set of dangers. Our modern world relies on smooth, well-maintained roads and efficient transportation systems. But for people in the Middle Ages, winter turned every journey into a perilous undertaking. The roads themselves were often little more than dirt tracks, poorly maintained even in good weather. Add to that deep snow, treacherous ice, and thick mud from thawing and refreezing, and you had paths that were incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to navigate. Bridges could be washed out or crumble under the weight of snow and ice, forcing travelers to find dangerous detours. The available means of travel were incredibly slow and exposed. Most people traveled on foot, trudging through the snow, carrying whatever meager belongings they had. Those with more means might use a horse, but even then, a horse could slip on ice or get bogged down in deep drifts. Ox carts, used for transporting goods, became incredibly inefficient, their heavy wooden wheels sinking into the mire or struggling against icy inclines. The sheer time it took to cover even short distances meant that travelers were exposed to the elements for prolonged periods, increasing their risk of hypothermia and frostbite. Perhaps the most immediate and terrifying threat to travelers was the sudden onset of a blizzard or a severe snowstorm. These weren't just inconvenient, they could be deadly. A sudden whiteout could disorient travelers completely, causing them to lose their way even on familiar routes. Pathways would disappear under fresh snow, landmarks would become obscured, and the biting wind combined with heavy snowfall could quickly lead to death by exposure or freezing. Many stories from the era recount unfortunate souls found frozen solid, lost mere miles from their destination, caught unawares by the fury of a winter storm. Beyond natural hazards, the desolate and difficult conditions of winter roads also created opportunities for human threats. Bandits and robbers often preyed on vulnerable travelers, knowing that isolated stretches of road, made even more remote by the harsh weather, offered perfect opportunities for ambush. A traveler, already weakened by cold and hunger, carrying any valuables, became an easy target. Finally, the difficulty of winter travel meant that entire towns and villages could become isolated for weeks or even months. This severely hampered the delivery of vital supplies, leading to localized shortages, even if other regions had food. News traveled slowly, if at all, and aid could not reach those in need, leaving communities to face the brutal winter largely on their own. The act of traveling in medieval winter was a grim lottery, where every journey held the potential for disaster. After hearing about the relentless challenges of medieval winters, the bitter cold, the gnawing hunger, the pervasive diseases, the threat of fire, and the dangers of travel, it's easy to wonder how anyone survived. But the incredible truth is, they did. The story of medieval people in winter isn't just one of hardship. It's a profound testament to extraordinary human resilience. They faced adversity that would overwhelm most of us today, yet they found ways not only to endure, but to live, to connect, and to hope. A cornerstone of their endurance was undoubtedly faith. For many, deep religious belief provided an essential source of hope and solace in a world that often seemed arbitrary and cruel. The promise of an afterlife, the comfort of prayer, and the communal strength found in shared worship offered a psychological buffer against despair. It instilled a sense of patience, a belief that suffering had a purpose, and that divine intervention could provide relief. This spiritual strength often gave them the inner fortitude to face another freezing day, another empty stomach, or another loss, fostering a quiet resolve to persevere. Beyond faith, the immediate and tangible support came from their family and community. As we've discussed, families often lived together, pooling their resources and labor. But this extended beyond immediate relatives. The medieval village or town was a tightly woven tapestry of relationships. Neighbors relied on neighbors. Whether it was sharing meager food supplies, lending a hand with firewood gathering, or simply offering a warm place by the fire for a cold traveler, the collective effort was vital. This deep sense of mutual dependence and solidarity meant that individuals were rarely left completely alone to face their struggles, providing an invaluable safety net against the harshest elements. Despite the overwhelming difficulties, medieval people also understood the importance of finding small joys and moments of reprieve. The winter festivals we touched upon, like the Christmas season or Plough Monday, weren't just religious observances, they were crucial psychological breaks. These were times for rare feasts, for communal storytelling by the fire, for simple games, and for the joy of music and song. These shared moments of laughter and connection served as a vital counterbalance to the pervasive gloom, reminding them of their shared humanity and the simple pleasures that could still be found even in the bleakest of times. These were the sparks of light they cultivated in the profound darkness. And finally, underlying all of their efforts was the unwavering hope for spring. Every freezing night, every meager meal, every aching bone was endured with the knowledge that winter was a season, and like all seasons, it would eventually pass. This deep-seated belief in the cycle of life, the promise that the sun would return, the ice would melt, and the earth would once again yield its bounty, was a powerful motivator. It wasn't just a distant wish, it was an ingrained certainty that provided the emotional fuel to keep going, to survive this winter, and to prepare for the renewed life that would inevitably follow. It's a powerful reminder of how hope in its purest form can be the ultimate tool for survival. As we gently drift back from the harsh realities of medieval winter, take a moment to truly appreciate the journey we've just shared. This wasn't just a historical account of a cold season. It was a deep dive into an era where winter itself was an all-encompassing trial. It challenged every aspect of life, from the very architecture of their homes to the depths of human spirit. It was a time of immense struggle, where survival was a daily, hard-won victory against the relentless forces of nature and the constant threat of hunger, disease, and isolation. Now, as you lie there, perhaps feeling the warmth of your blanket or the steady hum of your heating system, let these simple comforts resonate. Think about the effortless access to hot food, clean water, and safe shelter that we often take for granted. Imagine the stark contrast with a medieval peasant's hovel, or even a lord's drafty castle. This realization isn't meant to make you feel guilty, but rather to foster a profound sense of gratitude for the conveniences of modern life. Your comfortable bed, the cozy warmth of your room, the easily accessible nourishment. These are privileges our ancestors could only dream of during those long, dark months. The story of medieval winter is ultimately a powerful lesson in human resilience. What can we learn from the unwavering spirit of our ancestors? Perhaps it's the importance of community, of leaning on each other when times are tough. Or maybe it's the sheer power of hope, of finding small moments of joy and celebration even when surrounded by hardship. It's a reminder that humans are incredibly adaptable, capable of enduring far more than we often realize. Their ability to find light in the deepest darkness, to persist with unwavering faith, and to work together for mutual survival, serves as an inspiring testament to the strength of the human spirit. So, as the quiet of the night settles around you, let these echoes of a distant past gently fade. Take comfort in the warmth and security that surrounds you now. And perhaps, as you drift off to sleep, you'll carry with you a quiet appreciation for the journey our ancestors undertook, a journey that paved the way for the comforts we enjoy today. Rest well, knowing that even in the most brutal of winters, humanity found a way to survive, to hope, and to finally embrace the promise of spring. Good night.